Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Book Bites. And I am absolutely thrilled to welcome Mary Lou Stevens to the chat today. Hi, Mary Lou. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, Sandy. It's lovely to be here. I'm on the Sunshine Coast at the moment, and it's beautiful.
Excellent. And welcome back to Australia. For those of you who don't know, Mary Lou's been travelling around the world, having all sorts of adventures, and has just been back in Australia for the last couple of weeks. So it's fabulous that you're here to join us today. We might ask you a couple of questions about that later. But before we get into today's chat about food in fiction, I'm just going to pop up the details of the giveaway that we're having. So for anyone who asks a question or leaves a comment, either here during the live, or if you're watching this back later, we'll leave the competition open until 6 p.m. Saturday night, Sydney time. You will go into the draw to win a copy of Mary Lou's fabulous book, The Chocolate Factory. Not this copy, because as you can see, this is an ARC. I was lucky to get an early copy, but you'll get a fresh, brand new copy of Mary Lou's book. So please do ask questions and leave comments for Mary Lou or myself as we travel along. So as we said, food in fiction. It's a wonderful, wonderful marriage of two of my favourite things. And you have taken this with your first book, The Last of the Apple Blossom, and your second book, this one that we're talking about today, The Chocolate Factory. So I wanted to start by asking you, what has drawn you into focusing your first two novels on food?
Complete and utter accident. Well, not accident. I'm going to call it fate, actually. I had written 3 novels, all contemporary, all went nowhere, all got rejected. And then one day, after interviewing Monica McInerney, who then went on to become my mentor for The Last of the Apple Blossom, this idea just hit me out of the blue for The Last of the Apple Blossom, a book that starts with the 1967 bushfires in Tasmania, traces the demise of the apple industry through the eyes of 2 neighbouring women on their orchards. And so I was writing about apples. And then when that did well and my publisher said, what else have you got for us? I had this idea. I actually already done a lot of the research. And I said, I have this idea. It's about the first Cadbury's factory. It was in Tasmania, the first one out of Bourneville in Tasmania. And the people who came out and the locals who worked, 2 different women. And it's about chocolate, spies, and Quakers. And my publisher at the time went, fantastic, came back with a 2-book deal and said, so what do you think for the 3rd one? And I went, I've got this other idea, and it's actually based in Hobart again, and it's about jam, the jam industry. Hobart was the capital of the jam industry back then, and everyone heard of IXL Jam and Henry Jones, but he had a big rival. And so my publisher went, oh, fantastic. It's a historical foodie fiction trilogy. And until that moment, I actually hadn't realised myself. I was just writing books about things I wanted to write about. I was born and bred in Tassie. I absolutely love that place. It has a very rich history of food, as it turns out. And one of my very good friends, I'm just going to put up one of her books, Josephine Moon. She writes fabulous, fabulous foodie fiction. And I said, I'm sorry, Jo, I've kind of stolen your genre quite by accident. I didn't mean to do it. But of course, it's historical. So Jo writes contemporary, I write historical, and it's completely fine. And I love writing about food. I'm a big foodie. I love all the cooking that's involved when I write these books, because everything that my characters eat, I have to bake. And every chocolate they eat, I have to eat. So it's a nice side perk. Plus, there's a lot of things I can now claim on my tax, like chocolate.
I don't know why I didn't think of this before. You are now my hero in life, I think, Mary Lou. And my next book is going to be about chocolate, just so I can claim it back on the tax.
I thoroughly recommend it. People reading The Chocolate Factory go, oh, my God, I just find myself going out to buy Cadbury's and eating chocolate. And I went, I spent a year writing it, then the next year editing it, and I just ate chocolate the entire time. I came back from Asia. One of my friends said, you put on weight. How can you put on weight in Asia? And I said, you can put on weight anywhere if you eat the amount of chocolate I have. I visited a lot of chocolate factories while I was there as well.
Well, thank you very much for putting your body on the line. We'll get into the Chocolate Factory more in a moment. We've got a hello from Yvonne. Lovely for you to join us. Bev is here as well today. Julie Bennett, another historical fiction author, is with us. Janet, one of our longtime viewers here at Book Bites, loved Apple Blossom. And Yvonne worked at the IXL factory in Newtown in the late 50s. So there you go.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you write historical foodie fiction, and that Jo Moon, who a lot of my readers will know, I've had Jo here on Book Bites before, and is a fabulous Australian women's fiction author, writes contemporary foodie fiction. What is it that you think makes it such a good combination when we combine food with fiction?
I think it's the delving into the sensory realm,
I think Mary Lou might be frozen.
signal. But no, there it is, back again.
Oh, here she comes.
Yeah, I'm back again. So it really uses all the senses, which in writing is a wonderful thing, because it gets you into the space, into the character, into the place, through smell, through taste, through touch, through sight, all those things. It's all there when you write about food. So I love that sensory element of it. And also, so many of us love to eat, funnily enough, and to cook, funnily enough. And so there's also that point of connection with readers that's there. Mm-hmm. And when you delve a little bit into the different elements of it, as Josephine Moon does so beautifully in her contemporary fiction, and other people do in their historical fiction, the history of food comes into, of course, the historical fiction. And so there's fascinating stuff around that as well.
And food isn't just food, is it? It's part of our culture. It's part, as you mentioned, of our history. And I think a lot of it also comes to do with nurturing and love. And so I think it's not a surprise that it's a lot of female writers that write about food in fiction. It's one way that we show that we love people, isn't it?
Absolutely. And yeah, it's a cultural thing coming together, the connection, the different things that people do, people bringing over something for you to eat, bringing ingredients over if they have a glut of zucchinis or apples. I don't know anyone who ever has a glut of chocolate, however, so I'm going to have to think about that one.
Not for very long anyway.
Yeah, so there's lots of points of connection there. And you're right, it's about love. I mean, for me, this is so corny, and it's not original. The best ingredient in cooking is love. Absolutely.
Absolutely. I would agree with you there. Craig and Phil have joined us. Hi, guys. Lovely to see you here. Janet says that she doesn't need to read books to eat chocolate. She'll just eat chocolate anyway, but also loves reading. Helen is looking forward to reading The Chocolate Factory. She's sure she will love it as much as she did Apple Blossom. And Craig and Phil have already read The Chocolate Factory and said it is a magnificent read. You and I were talking off camera before we went live about some other foodie fiction writers, and you mentioned quite a few of your favourites. Do you have a favourite foodie fiction writer?
Oh, I got to go Josephine Moon. From the tea chest, she's written about honey and chocolate and coffee and cheese and lemons, and I just think she nailed it. She was going to write a book about apples that hasn't eventuated yet. I'm holding my breath for that one. So we'll see what happens. But also, I loved what Bonnie Gammis did in Lessons in Chemistry around food, because it's a whole different angle on it. And I loved it, the whole cooking show, the way she approached cooking with her own personality and how that was done, and just how good she was at it. So there can be different elements in how you treat food. And like Water for Chocolate, beautiful magic realism. And Tita would just cook these dishes. So that's in 12 chapters with 12 parts with 12 different recipes for each one. And the effect that the food would have on people just goes into a whole different realm. So there's a lot of things you can do around writing about food in novels.
So let's delve into The Chocolate Factory itself. And I wanted to ask you, and you mentioned it already at the beginning, that this centres around the very first Cadbury's factory outside of the UK, which was set up in Tasmania. So what was it about that particular event that made you want to write about it?
When I was a kid growing up in Hobart, our favourite ever school excursion, can't imagine why, was going on a tour of the Cadbury's factory. And talk about sensory experiences and how smell is such a powerful emotive force in bringing on memories. I will never forget the smells, the aromas in that factory. And it was back in the days where occupational health and safety, I don't think had ever been heard of. So you could be right up to the conveyor belt where the centres are going through the enrobers. You could pick things off the conveyor belt. They had big barrels of rejects, which you could just fill your pockets with. And then you'd get to the end, and I had my first ever cup of hot cocoa at the end of the tour, and they gave you a free box of chocolates. It was just a child's dream. I mean, talk about Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which we might have time to, because part of that is based in truth, and there's part that truth is in my book. It was like that for kids. It was just amazing. So it was a real treat to go to the Cadbury factory, and I remember it. You go from the roasting of the beans to the grinding to the melanges, where it doesn't smell all that good. It's kind of vinegary. Sometimes that has actually turned people off eating chocolate. But if you hang on in there and you get to the conches where the magic happens, where the chocolate is just stirred and grinded up to 72 hours to make it smooth and just delicious, then, you're hooked for life. And I certainly was. So there was that element. There's also this. So this was invented in 1905. It became the most popular chocolate in the world. And all Cadbury's competitors were after this. And chocolate espionage was huge back then. So we're talking 1905. This is through to 1921 when my book starts. And Roald Dahl was actually a taste tester for Cadbury when he was a boy. His boarding school was right next to Bourneville. And so his lifelong love of chocolate came from being a taste tester for Cadbury. And he was aware of this chocolate espionage that was happening. So there's that part in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory where Grandpa Joe talks about chocolate spies and why the gates are closed and why you don't see workers coming in and out. That's all based on truth. That's actually what was happening. Wow. And the third element for the Chocolate Factory is the history of the Cadbury family and the fact that all the big chocolate makers were Quakers. And they got into it with hot chocolate back in the day as an alternative to alcohol, because Quakers are very big in social responsibility, and they just saw how the poor, dissolute people were doing and went, there's an alternative here. Let's do that. It's cheap, it's healthy. So Cadbury, Rowntree's, Fry's, Terry's, all Quaker family. Yeah. And I find it fascinating because I went to the biggest Quaker school in the world, which is in Hobart, where I grew up.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many fascinating elements of history that you've woven through the Chocolate Factory. And one of the ones that was surprising for me was the spying that happens, because I guess it makes logical sense. Anything that involves a lot of money is going to cause, that sort of thing to happen. But I would never have thought of chocolate as being the center of a really big spy drama.
It's phenomenal. So the competitors would send chocolate spies into the factories disguised as employees. And then Cadbury's would employ detectives, chocolate detectives, to try and sneak them out. This recipe kept in a vault, and anyone who knew it was actually, they had to sign a legal agreement that they would never divulge the recipe. It was that important. Most of Cadbury's success was built on dairy milk, and just everybody wanted it because it was so popular. It's a great chocolate. And it's great to be back in Australia. I mean, I've been able to buy Cadbury dairy milk everywhere I've gone. There's a factory in Malaysia. There's a factory in India. The Malaysian one's pretty good, actually. And I get back to Australia, though, and all the different varieties of dairy milk, all the different permutations that they've made that just go on for shelves. And I'm like, oh, I haven't tried that one yet. Oh, Lamington. Oh, my goodness. I've got to try that. and on it goes. Yeah, so you can see why people wanted it. It's just a perennial favourite. It's never stopped being popular. I think to this day, and this is the 200th anniversary of Cadbury this year. To this day, dairy milk is the most popular chocolate in the UK.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, I understand why. I consume huge amounts of this. There might be some Cadbury's Marvellous Creations Rocky Road in my fridge right now.
Yeah, but you can see why the competitors were so keen to get their hands on it, because it was a magic recipe. It really was.
Yeah. And particularly for the day.
Yes.
Back in those times, it was a new thing as well.
Yes, and it had been very hard to actually. I'm going to be a bit blasphemous here, but this is my knowledge that I've found from going to so many different factories in Southeast Asia. And there are a lot of chocolate makers in Southeast Asia. It's a real booming thing because cacao is so easy to grow there. Yeah. It's quite a simple thing to make a good dark chocolate.
Yes.
To make a good dairy milk chocolate is very difficult. And many people had tried before George Cadbury Jr. got it right. And they spent a lot of money and a lot of time trying to get it right. So it's hard. And up until dairy milk, it was quite horrible. It was chalky. It was gritty. Yeah. But he hit on the recipe. And that's why it became so popular, because big surprise, not everyone loves dark chocolate. They just don't.
I'm one of them. For sure. Phil has said that the fresh Tasmanian milk makes a difference too within the Hobart factory. Janet says chocolate dairy milk is pretty popular in her house as well. Oh, hang on. We've got some controversy coming up in the comments here. I don't know whether you can weigh in on this or not, Mary Lou. Leanne's Kiwi mum swears that New Zealand Cadbury tastes better than Australian Cadbury.
Well, it might have in its day. I mean, the dairy cattle in New Zealand, they're pretty good. I went to a lot of Asian countries where they import New Zealand dairy products, cheese, butter, before, as a preference rather than Australian. But sadly, the New Zealand Cadbury factory closed down. So everything that was made in New Zealand, including, their favourites like the pineapple lumps and all of those kinds of things, they're all made in Tasmania now. Yeah, which is okay. Yeah.
I wonder if Leanne's mum would still swear that it tastes better when she buys it in New Zealand, though. Bev said she visited the Cadbury factory when she was a teenager, and she still remembers it. I have to say, I went to Tasmania at the beginning of last year with my daughter and her school band, and I was very excited because I'd never been. I'm like, yes, and I'll get to go to the Cadbury factory. And I looked it up, and they don't do tours anymore. I was heartbroken.
There was such an effort to keep the tours going, and there was this real move to have something like at Bourneville, which is the Cadbury World, which is an immersive experience. It's not a tour of the factory, it's separate. And so the people in Tasmania were going, well, everyone comes to Tasmania to go to Mona, the Museum of Old and New, which is, world famous. But if they bring their kids, what are the kids going to do? Cadbury's is close by. We could have a Cadbury World there. So that's the payoff for the kids. They get dragged around Mona, and then the next day they can go to Cadbury World at Claremont. And I thought that's a genius idea. I think a politician somewhere made it an election promise or a platform, but of course it never happened. And to be quite honest, Sandy, I've been out to that factory several times. I haven't been allowed inside for various reasons, and it doesn't even smell of chocolate anymore. And I know from seeing footage inside, it's just all automated. Yeah. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to go to chocolate factories through Southeast Asia, to see how it would have been made back in the 1920s. That real thing. People still hand wrapping the chocolate, all that kind of stuff, and putting the little centres in the boxes. All that is still happening in Asia, where is in Australia it's all mechanised.
Well, at least I don't feel like I've missed out on too much then.
You would have seen a lot of conveyor belts and little robotic arms if you'd been
Leanne is going to do a taste test with her mum to double check the whole New Zealand versus Australia chocolate thing. And she does love pineapple lumps. Now, we can't talk about this book without talking about the main character, well, one of the two main characters, Dorothy. She travels from the UK to Tasmania, and I would say that she's quite a modern woman for her time. As you said, we're looking at the very early 1920s in this novel, and she works her way up through the ranks of Cadbury, and she's across all aspects of the factory and the chocolate making. And I wanted to ask you where Dorothy came from.
There's a lot of academic papers written about the women who came out, also the opening of the factory, what it meant to Tasmania and Tasmanians. I did a lot of research. I found 3 people who had written theses on this, and they very generously allowed me to access their theses, their academic papers, and have chats with them. So Emma Robertson in particular, she wrote The Bells of Bourneville and Bristol, transnational agents in Tasmania 1920s or something like that. I know. And she had accounted, only 35 women came out from Bourneville. The rest were all local employees. But they were brought out especially because of their expertise to train and set up the family. But there are all these fabulous accounts of these women, where they'd come from, what their jobs were, what they did while they were there, whether they stayed or not, and what happened. So I had all this factual stuff that I then turned into Dorothy. So those things like, of course, the women all worked during World War I. Quakers are very famous for their pacifism, but they didn't stop people going to fight. It was the Great War. It was considered a great cause. So a lot of men were gone, and a lot of engineers were gone. So women also had jobs that they wouldn't normally have. Now, sadly, Dorothy's husband dies in the Great War, and that is how she is able to keep working once the war is over, and the men who do come back to their jobs, and the marriage bar is put back in place quite firmly. So, but she's now a young widow, so she can keep working. And in a way, the love that she had for her beloved Freddie is replaced by this ambition, to make her way in the world, to be of use. And this is the other thing that comes through in the book, that women were very useful during that time. And they had this sense of purpose, and they were working, and they were promoted and all that kind of stuff. And then after the war, where Britain was supposed to have won and everything is just in pieces, they lack that sense of purpose. So for Dorothy to be handpicked as these women to go to Tasmania to help start this new factory gives her that sense of purpose again.
Yeah, she was a fabulous character, and one of the aspects that I don't know how to say it, that made me angry, I guess, throughout the novel, was the fact that the marriage bar was put back in, which meant if you were a married woman, you could no longer work outside of the home. And I was like, but that's not right. When these women are doing fantastic things.
Yeah, all that expertise lost. Yeah. Happened after the war as well. Yeah. When they're needed, they're invaluable. When they're not, just cast them aside.
Yeah, and there's a whole nother chat we could have about that, isn't there? The other point of view that the story is told from is from the gorgeous little Maisie, and she's a protege of Dorothy's, you could say, and she's quite naive at the start of the novel, and she goes on quite a journey. And one of the things that struck me was just how young these women were. Maisie is only 18, and Dorothy's in her early 20s. Is that correct?
24.
Yeah, early to mid 20s. And so very, very young. My daughter's 18, and so I was trying to picture, Maisie and my daughter doing the same sort of things. And while she was naive from a, understanding the world point of view, they're doing pretty big things as these young women, taking on these jobs and the responsibilities that they were given at such a young age. I found that really fascinating.
Yes, it was a very different time then. One of Maisie's main ambitions is to enable her younger sister, who's really clever, to stay in school, because everyone left school at 14.
Yeah.
You were lucky to keep going to school until 14. So Maisie's already been out in the workforce full-time for 4 years. She's done several different jobs. And the girls in Hobart at the time saw Cadbury's as a real saviour because they had great pay and great conditions, which certainly wasn't the case. And also Maisie has this enormous sense of responsibility because her mum, who's a war widow and who's not very well, Maisie wants to step up and make sure her mum's okay, her younger brother, her little sister. So at 18, she does have the world on her shoulders, quite literally.
Yeah.
And Dorothy at 24 has been working since she was 8 because she came from the slums of Birmingham, and you just had to pay your way, no matter how bad that job was. You just had to do it. So she's 24, but in my mind, these women are a lot older because they've had all this experience. Yeah.
I just kept coming back to that, you know, I guess because my daughter has just turned 18, I just kept coming back to that. And I was blown away by it. Janet's just left a comment saying that she was working at a time when married women couldn't have superannuation.
Well, for those of you who've read The Last of the Apple Blossom, in the 70s, Catherine can't get a bank loan.
Yes.
Without a husband's signature, and she doesn't have a husband, or a father's signature, and her father doesn't want her to buy the orchard. So she's totally stuck. And that's in the 70s.
Yeah.
And women reading that book said, I couldn't get a credit card, I couldn't get a loan. Yeah, astounding.
Yeah, it is. Joanne's dropped in and she's just saying hi, Jo. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier about the research that has been done. You know, you go into such vivid detail of how the factory works, and it's sprinkled throughout the whole story, really giving us some insight into what it was like to work in a factory like that. How much research did you have to do for this? And did anything surprise you during that research journey?
I'm going to start with a surprise. It's how flake was invented.
Yes, oh my God. One of my favourite chocolates. I got to that bit of the story, which is, I guess, about 3/4 of the way through. And I was like, yeah.
I went, oh, that's so good. That's going in. But with the research, there have been a couple of really great books written about the history of the Cadburys. There was another book that came out, but that was mainly about the marketing of Cadburys. And there is a heritage officer in Melbourne. So everything's owned by Mondelez now, all kinds of things like Oreo and Toblerone and Cadbury. They're all owned by this huge multinational. He's in Melbourne. He works a couple of days a week. His name is Bruce Smith, and he's a fabulous man. And he was able to access material from the archives in Bourneville about the Cadbury factory opening, about all the stuff around it, about the women who came out, with photos, with all this kind of stuff. And he loved it because he said most people just get in contact with him to find out about when their favourite chocolate bar was released, or can you find the ad for the Flake Girl from 1980, you know, that kind of stuff. So for him to actually be involved in the level of research of this factory opening, he was just brilliant. He really was. So, and also Kaz Mitchell at Cadbury's itself, even though I wasn't allowed to go in, she took photos, she took videos, she came out to one of the benches in the Cadbury grounds with all this archival material. And then the history room at the State Library, there was a point where I had the original blueprint to, sorry about that noise, go away. Sorry, Sandy. The original blueprint to the Cadbury's factory in Tasmania just rolled out on this big table in the history reading room at the State Library. The original plans for the cottages, they just have a wealth of material there as well. And for anyone who writes historical fiction, it's a place we love, all of that. And then it gets to the rewriting, the editing, the drafting, and you start pulling it all out. And then it gets to your editor and she just writes, bog, too much information, you've fallen in a bog, pull this out. And you're left with the essentials, the things that keep moving the story forward. But all that research that may no longer be in print is still imbued through the pages of what you write.
Yeah. I think I read somewhere once that 90% of the research that we do doesn't make it onto the page.
Yeah, that whole iceberg thing. And I will say that when I was writing this one, The Last of the Apple Blossom, I wrote the first draft, which was massive, and then I went to do the second draft, and I was bored. I was bored by my own research, and it was just like yank, yank, yank. But because you've done it all, you want to put it on the page. And then you go, I'm yawning here.
Now, another area of research that I imagine that you had to do was surrounding two of the male characters of the book, Thomas and Frank. And because we are just post-World War I, and they each had a particular role that affected their lives from the war, did anything surprising come up when researching Thomas and Frank's stories?
I was fairly familiar with Frank's story already. As I said, I went to the biggest Quaker school in the world, so there were certain things about Quakerism that I was very familiar with. I think with Thomas, and it's not a spoiler to say this, he has shell shock, and the different treatments at the time and the way these men were treated. I had a little bit of an inkling, but I never knew that porridge was supposedly a cure for shell shock. It didn't work.
I wonder why.
And that so many men, I feel like crying even saying this, they were locked up in asylums, post-traumatic stress, and they are locked up as if they're mad. And the help and the resources that we have today, they just weren't available. And also a lot of these men were labelled as cowards. Some of them did try to run away and they were shot by their own side. Look, it sounds really quite heavy now talking about this. Hopefully I've had a little bit of a lighter hand in the book, but it was important to me. And what might work, what might not work, what Dorothy tries, whatever, it's just a very hard subject because post-traumatic stress disorder is a very serious thing and it's hard to deal with. Yes, but I knew a lot about it, but I didn't know the severity of how the men were treated, and I certainly didn't know that porridge was supposedly a cure.
Mm-hmm. I really do think you handled it beautifully throughout the story, and without giving any spoilers away, I did fall in love with both of those men through the story. You handled them both beautifully, so well done on that. Now, you mentioned that the secrecy around the dairy milk recipe is huge, and in this story, that is one of the things that comes through, one of the driving forces of the story. Is it still a closely guarded secret?
The recipe is still kept in a vault.
Okay.
However, the original recipe and the ones that the recipe that's used in some places, but the recipe has changed over the years. I don't know, people probably remember, maybe not. They may not be as obsessed with Cadbury's as I am. The furor when they introduced palm oil into the recipe, which is something you should never put in anything. But especially vegetable oil in chocolate is just such a big no-no. So there was a big furor over that. So over the time, the recipe has changed. And over the years, big changes came in when Kraft bought out Cadbury's, and that was very upsetting for a lot of people. And so they actually changed the way the chocolate was made back then. And then, of course, Mondelez owns them now. So there have been changes to the recipe, but I can say that the Cadbury dairy milk is delicious. Apparently the New Zealand one was delicious when it was made there. I'm not a big fan of the Indian Cadbury milk. I'm not quite sure what they do to it. You can read that it's got the same ingredients, but it's like, maybe it is the quality of the milk or how we do milk before they put it into the chocolate. But so there are several recipes around, but the original is still kept in a vault.
Now, another part of your research, I know, was to taste test different Cadbury Dairy Milk versions. Do you have a favourite chocolate, Mary Lou?
I love, and have since I was a kid in the milk tray chocolate box.
Mm-hmm.
Hazelnut swirl, I think that's what it's called.
Yep.
Roasted hazelnuts and chocolate, to me, are just the magic combination. I love that. And I will happily chomp through a block of hazelnut dairy milk. But I'm also really, really happy with just the plain dairy milk too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's good. I've tasted some really bad dairy milks in Southeast Asia. Well, not dairy milks, just milk chocolates.
Yep.
And one exceptional one from northern Thailand that I just went, oh my goodness, I don't know what you've done here, but you've really hit the jackpot. But Cadbury Dairy Milk, to me, it's still a favourite. I've tried to love dark chocolate. I'm just too unsophisticated. I can't drink coffee, and I'm not a fan of dark chocolate. I'm just not sophisticated. That's the truth.
I'm 100% with you on both of those counts. Now, before we let you go, I'm just going to give people a chance to ask another question if they want to, or need a comment to go into the draw. And I'm going to pop up the details of where you can find Mary Lou online. Now, one other question that I wanted to ask you, well, I've got two questions actually before I finish off. In your newsletter this week, I'm pretty sure it was just a couple of days ago your newsletter dropped, you had a recipe in the newsletter, which is something that Dorothy, I'll pop it on the big screen in a minute, something that Dorothy makes in the book towards the end there. Do you want to hold that up again, Mary Lou, the recipe card? So this was in Mary Lou's newsletter, and you have made this recipe.
I have photographic proof. And another recipe on the other side, which I have also made. Yeah.
That was also mentioned in the book as well.
Yeah, so one of these recipes, this recipe, Dorothy makes, the chocolate cream biscuits, and this one, the chocolate vermicelli gâteau, Sarah makes. So I've made them. These recipes are actually from a vintage Cadbury cocoa cookbook that was released to promote the new Tasmanian factory. So you just had to write into the newsletter and they'd send you this out. And I managed to find a copy online, and I went, I'm making as many recipes from this as I can. And when we were talking about marketing and promotion for the book, HQ said, we had huge success. Victoria Perman's book, A Woman's Work, all about the Women's Weekly Cookery Competition, which I just thought was an inspired idea for a book. The cheese and gherkin scones, they made a recipe card for that. So they went, let's do a recipe card for the chocolate factory. And I was so thrilled. So I sent them these recipes. And when this came back, just looking so gorgeous. It's just so gorgeous. So you come to an event, buy a book, and you'll get a recipe card. And I can vouch for both these recipes because I had made them.
Excellent, excellent. Phil's the same with us on the coffee and dark chocolate. So that's why we're kindred spirits with Phil. Bev is looking forward to reading both of your books. Yvonne has it on reserve at the library, and apparently there's a long wait, which is, we love to hear that as authors, don't we, Mary Lou? I'm just going to pop those contact details up again because I didn't leave them up for very long, and I'm going to ask you my last question. As I mentioned at the top of today's chat, you are travelling around the world at the moment, something called slow travel, where you spend a couple of months in each destination. And I'm wondering, are you getting inspiration from your travels and the food that you are experiencing while you're traveling that may turn up in a future story?
I have eaten a lot of bean-to-bar chocolate. When I say I don't like dark chocolate, I've had to have it as part of the experience. I've met some phenomenal chocolate makers, some very passionate people throughout the world. But I've done chocolate, so I won't be going there. But I have been inspired by the independent Malaysian state of Borneo. If I wrote a story set there, I know exactly what it would be about, and it would be about the English women who were married to a couple of the white Rajas there. It's just, I read so many history books while we're in Sarawak. It's just phenomenal. And we will be heading to South America next month. We're starting in Uruguay, but we will go to Paraguay, and their history is fascinating. And once again, there's a really interesting Irish woman who came out as the consort to one of the cruel and horrible dictators, and they've certainly had a few of those in Paraguay. And I find her story interesting. So they're both kind of keyed into my fascination with historical fiction. However, I still have some Tasmanian stories to tell that, that don't involve food. People say, are you going to write about Cascade Brewery? No. To write a historical fiction book, it's so much work, all the research, the writing, the editing, everything. You're with that book for a couple of years. I don't know, Cascade, all well and good. There's just not the love there for it that I feel about these other books. Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us here today on Book Bites, Mary Lou. It's been a fascinating chat. And if you want to find out how Flake came to be, you need to get yourself a copy of The Chocolate Factory and discover it for yourself. And as I said, I do remember going, oh, when I got to that part of the book. We will leave the comments open. As the regular viewers will know, you can pop back in at any point and watch this on Facebook. And if you do pop in any questions, if you are watching this back later, we can pop in and answer them in the comments section for you. Julie Bennett is saying she will see you next Thursday.
Yeah,
is that at the Red?
Yeah, Better Red with Claudine Tonellis sitting beside me. I'm really looking forward to that one. Yeah,
yes. And I'm going to that event as well, and I'm going to get my book signed at that event, which I'm very excited about. Bev says thank you for chat. Yeah, have a wonderful rest of your time here in Australia. I'll give you a big hug next week when I see you, and thank you for joining us, everyone. We'll see you next time on Book Bites.
Eat more chocolate.
Always.